welcome to week 1. We're going to start by learning After Effects and the basics of motion design. I start off with a quote by Lao Tzu, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step. And a more comedic way of looking at this is the joke I always tell at the beginning of the semester. How to eat an elephant? One bite at a time. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by learning big concepts bit by bit by bit. And by the end of the class, I should say at the end of the semester, you're going to have a very deep, full, rich understanding of motion design and After Effects, in which you'll be able to teach yourself and follow along to any new tutorials you want, because I'm going to teach you all the professional basics that are in demand now, the current way of looking at it. Because I'm still in the field, and this is how I stay fresh with my knowledge and share it with you. We're going to begin by opening up After Effects, clicking New Project, and this is the way we're going to be working throughout the whole semester. Composition, new composition. And all of your projects are going to be 1920 by 1080 with square pixels, 24 frames per second, full resolution. Now the duration is going to change. The first assignment, an animated logo, that's going to be 10 seconds. So I'm going to begin by typing 10:00. I'm going to explain that in a moment once we tackle time code. So again, everything you hand in for me will be at 1920 by 1080, square pixels, 24 frames per second, full resolution, 10 for the duration of the first assignment, 10 seconds. It's going to change for the second assignment. This is what you're going to want for the first one. And then you click OK. And then you can save your file. I'm going to go File, Save As, and name it. I'll just call this week 1. So I'm going to hit Save. Now I'm all set to start animating. Okay. So the basic layout is over here, you'll see the blue highlight going around the panel. That shows you what panel you're selected on. All right. So we're selected. This is the project panel. This is where you import art, images, videos, sound effects, anything you want. It's like a giant storage bin for all the images used to make up your project. Over here is the composition window. This is what the viewer is going to see when it's all rendered out. And before you render it out, that's your project file where you're going back and forth in your timeline and editing. They're going to see the finished product, which is what will be the render. The composition window is right there. Okay. Down here is the timeline. Okay. So, and over here are the effects panels. That's your main work area. If you're not seeing this, try small screen up at the workspaces. You could set it up however you like, but it's easy to start off with less things open. Here, all these panels are stacked, but the one you're going to be using most is effects and presets. So again, you got your project panel where you assemble all your clips, your composition window, the panel, which is where you're previewing your artwork, and your timeline down here where you're adding your keyframes and animating. All right, so up here are the tools, and the main tools we're going to be using are the selection arrow, the shapes, as well as the pen tool and the text tool for now. But you're going to learn all of these, what they are, what they do. The beauty of working with After Effects is you can play to your strengths. If you're really good with typography, you can animate type and do some dynamic things with type. If you've got great hand drawing skills, you can scan in your illustrations or draw on the computer and animate them and bring life to your projects. If you're good at photo collages, you could work off of photos and animate and manipulate those. Or if you got a strong background in video, you could spice up your video with After Effects. So really, it helps strengthen what you're already good at. It gives you a chance to play around with some other things you might not be so good at. So we're going to begin our journey with the absolute basics, okay? We're going to start off with the square tool. It's basically like the shape tools in Illustrator. If you hold down Shift, you'll get a square. Now, for mine, this right here is the anchor point, and mine defaulted to the center of it. And new in Adobe After Effects, if you go Edit, Preferences, General, Center Anchor Point and New Shape Layers. You may need to turn that on, but it's going to help with your animating if it's always centered at the beginning and then you can move it later on, which we'll be getting into. So that was Edit, Preferences, Center Anchor Point, and New Shape Layers. So that's just in case you're not seeing what I'm doing. All right, now the basics of motion design. You've got your shape layer, as many as you're going to need or whatever you're going to animate in. But each layer will have a little twirl down menu right here. And you can twirl down one more time. And these basically are the 4 pillars of motion design. You've got position, scale, rotation, and opacity. Position is something moving from one spot to another. Scale is it getting larger, smaller. Rotation is it spinning or swinging around. And opacity is fading off and on. So those are the 4 pillars of motion design. Most animations you do will start off with position, scale, rotation, or opacity. One of those or all of them. It depends upon what you want to do. So here's your workflow, and we're going to stress this every step of the way. So step 1, think about what you want to do. It's always first. Have an idea. So step 2 is figure out how you're going to get that idea executed. All right? So motion design is graphic design, but including time and space. All right? So good layout and good design is key, but you gotta figure out how you're gonna get it to look like that, because things are gonna be moving around at different speeds throughout time. Figure out what you wanna do, how you want it to move, when you want it to move, and where you want it to move to. That's your basic idea tree. It's all gonna stem from there. So, working off of that, here is your animation workflow. Step 1, move the anchor point, okay? The anchor point will influence the animation. What's that mean? That means if I've got my phone and I'm doing rotate, if I have it at the center of the shape, it'll spin around like a propeller blade. If I put it up at the corner, it'll swing side to side like a pendulum, all right? The anchor point will influence the animation. If I've got it, let's take a look at the screen. So right here, I've got my anchor point in the center, and I'm going to start off by showing you how to move the anchor point. So I'm going to deselect the layer. This is the layer selected with it highlighted. I'm going to, so I deselected, I selected. This right here by the shape tool is the pan behind tool. This is what you use to move the anchor point. The selection arrow is what you move the layer around with. Just like in Illustrator or Photoshop, the black selection arrow tool moves an entire object or objects. The anchor point, the pan behind, will move the anchor. If you hold down Command or Control, it'll snap to a corner, a center point, or an edge. Okay, that's very useful. So I'm going to move my anchor point. Let's first think about what we want to do. So since I can't think, I'll put it in the middle. We'll do scale, all right? I'm going to put it in the middle for scale. So here it is in the middle. So I'm going to show you what I mean when I say where the anchor point is influences the animation. So here's my scale. If I scale this up, it's scaling up uniformly out of the middle from every side. I'm going to hit Command Z to undo. Now, if I move this, I'm holding down Command or Control, and I put it up at the top, and I go to scale. The top part is staying still and it's scaling out from there. That's one example. Now let's look at rotate. If I move it over to the corner and I rotate, it's swinging around like a pendulum. I'm going to move it to the middle and I'm going to do this. And now it's spinning around like a propeller blade. Where you have the anchor point influences the motion. Okay, so if something's going wrong, try changing the anchor point to a different spot. Step 1 is move the anchor point to where you think it should be to get the motion you want. All right? So for this, we're going to scale. Something simple. We're going to keep it at the middle. So I'm going to set my rotation back to 0. That's step 1. Move the anchor point. I'm going to want it, let's put it at the bottom. So I'm going to put it right here at the bottom middle. So I move the anchor point. Step 1, because I'm going to want it to grow up. Step 2, move the playhead to when you want the animation to start. So it doesn't have to start at the beginning of the timeline. You can have it start anywhere. So just to illustrate that point, I'll start right here. I moved my playhead. First I move the anchor point, then I move the playhead. Next, click on the stopwatch or stopwatches that you want to animate. I don't want this to scale, so I'm going to click on scale. I click the scale stopwatch. That adds my first keyframe, okay? You need a minimum of 2 keyframes to do anything with keyframe-based animation. It's over here, then it's over there. That's 2 keyframes. Or it was faded on, then it fades off. Change across time and space. 2 stops here and there, minimum 2 keyframes. So I move the anchor point first, then I move the playhead to where I want it to start, then I clicked on the stopwatch for what I wanted to animate. Now, here's the next step. Move the playhead in time to where you want the change to stop, okay? So I'm just gonna randomly pick right here. That's the next step. Then you make a change. Well, I'm gonna change the scale, so I'm gonna scale up, like that. So what's happening is, once I make that change, I have a second keyframe. And now it's changing over time. That workflow, again. Step 1, move the anchor point. You use the pan behind tool right here to move it where you want it to be. Always move the anchor point before you animate, or else you'll run into troubles. That's step 1. Step 2, move the playhead right here in the timeline. Clicking and dragging it is called scrubbing. Move the playhead to where you want your animation to start. Then click on the stopwatch for what you want to animate. Okay. Then you move your playhead in time, make a change, and that will make your next keyframe. These are the absolute musts with motion design. If you're doing keyframe animation, you must have at least 2 keyframes, okay? And they must be at least 1 frame apart, okay? Because it has to be a change over time. The closer the keyframes are, I'm going to hit the spacebar to preview this animation, the faster the animation. The further the keyframes are, the slower the change. So if you want to speed something up, move the keyframes closer together. You want to slow it down, move them further apart. So that's our basic workflow, okay? I'm going to do it one more time. Go delete that shape, draw a square. First I got to deselect the shape, then I select it. Now I can move the anchor point. I'm going to put my anchor point at the corner this time. I'm holding down Command or Control to snap it to either a corner, an edge, or a center. And you can get to your main stopwatches under Transform. Or here's a quick little shortcut. If you hit P, that'll pull up the position stopwatch, S for the scale stopwatch, R for the rotation stopwatch, T for opacity, think transparency. So I'm going to go back to S for scale. So I know what I want to do. I want to scale this up. I moved my anchor point because I know how I want it to move. Then I move my playhead. I click the stopwatch I want, scale, and I move forward in time. The closer the keyframes are together, the faster the change will be. The further apart, the slower the change will be. So I'll put it about here so it's a little slower this time. And then I'm just going to click and drag and make a change. So you need minimum of 2 keyframes, at least 1 frame apart, okay? Now, let's take a look at what we've got with our layer. Here is the shape layer for the square. Here is the twirl down menu option. This eyeball will show or hide that layer. If I've got multiple layers, this right here will solo the one I've got selected, meaning you won't see the other layers. You'll just see this one in your scene. Here's our stopwatch we've got selected. This diamond will add or remove a keyframe, okay? Once you click the stopwatch, that starts animating the properties for that stopwatch. If you click the stopwatch again, you lose all your keyframes, okay? Bear that in mind. Click it once and start making your changes. If you click it again, you're going to lose your keyframes. Now, let's look at these buttons right here. This will take you to the next keyframe. That will take you to the previous keyframe. I'll zoom out so you can see that change. Here's the playhead. Next keyframe, I click here. It snaps me there. If I want to go back, snaps me back. This is the most useful way of getting around your timeline, and here's why. If I move my playhead and then I make a change, say right here, that automatically creates another keyframe wherever the playhead is. I'm going to hit Command Z to undo that. That's why, to know that you're on a keyframe to change, you use the next and previous buttons. because any changes you make will create an unwanted extra keyframe. I'm going to delete this square and I'm going to make a circle. There's my circle. And because I made that preference change, my anchor point's automatically in the center. At this point, you know the basics. Think about what you want to do and then figure out how to get there. First step, always move the anchor point, move the playhead to where you want the animation to start, click on the stopwatch you think you want, position, scale, rotation, or transparency, or more than one stopwatch. Move your playhead in time. Closer it is, the faster the change, the further away, the slower the change will take place. Now, I'm going to show you some ways to make those changes. All right, now I'm going to show you different ways to make changes in After Effects. So, I've got my shape laid out, and we're going to use position for this. So I've got my shape layer selected. I'm going to hit P to pull up the position, or I could just twirl down here, open up my transform, and find position there. I like using the quick keys P, S, R, and T because it frees up space in your timeline and you can see things more easily when you've got a lot of layers. All right, so we're just going to leave the anchor point in the center because it's for position. I'm going to move my playhead to the beginning of the timeline and click position stopwatch because that's what I want to animate. And I'll just move to the 1 second mark. Now, here's a few ways you can make changes in After Effects. I can grab my selection arrow right here, click and drag. If I hold down Shift, it'll go either straight side to side or straight up and down. That's one way. I clicked and dragged to move the item. I'm going to hit undo, Command Z. Another thing I can do is I can hover over these numbers. The first number on the left is the X, that's side to side. The second number is Y, that's up and down. So I want to move side to side. I could just click and drag there. I'm going to hit undo. Third thing you can do, you can type in a specific number. So let's just add 1,000 to this. So I'll put a 1 at the beginning and hit the Enter key. And that created a keyframe. That's 3 different ways I can make that change. I can click and drag, I can hover and drag, or I can click once and type in an absolute number. It's all on how you want to make your changes and how precise you need to be. Lots of options. When you're in your timeline, you can click and drag to move the playhead or hit the space bar to preview your animation. The composition window up here will always reflect where the playhead is in the timeline. This drop-down menu is the magnification, how much you're seeing in the timeline. Right next to it is our time code. I'm going to click on it once to open up the time code window. Time code is read hours, minutes, seconds, and frames. So if I want to move this playhead to the 4 second mark, if I just type 4, that's going to be 4 frames. You have to remember, it's hours, minutes, seconds, and frames. So I'm going to type in 4, period, 00, and then hit the OK. And now our playhead is at the 4 second mark. Let's take a look at this motion path that was created. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can see it a little better. I'm zooming in and out of the composition window using my mouse wheel. If I click and hold down, I can scrub around in it. We're going to keep a close eye on these dots in our motion path. To select a keyframe, you can click once on it, or you can marquee drag like that by clicking and drag. If I move this keyframe closer, the dots get further apart. The further the dots are in a motion path, the faster the object is moving. If I move this further away, the closer the dots are in a motion path, the slower the object is moving. So as I move this closer to speed it up, you'll notice the dots in the motion path are moving further apart. So that's just a little pointer for looking at your motion paths and seeing how fast something's going to be moving based off of that. I'm going to zoom out by using my mouse wheel and then holding down the mouse wheel to move around. I'm going to delete this layer and I'm going to put in a star. Before we move on to the next part, I'm going to recap what we went over. Think about what you want to do, then figure out how to get there, okay? So, the 4 main pillars of motion design are position, scale, rotation, and transparency. Position, moving from one spot to another. Scale, getting larger or smaller over time. Rotation, spinning around or twirling. And transparency, fading off and on. Now here is your workflow once you know what you want to do. First, deselect the layer, then select it, and move your anchor point using the pan behind tool up here. Remember, if you hold down Control or Command, you can snap it to a corner or an edge or a side, okay? Your animation is based off of where that anchor point is. If you got it in the center and you scale, it's gonna scale out uniformly from the center, all right? So think about how it's gonna move. If you want a plant to grow up from the ground, put the anchor point at the bottom and scale up that way. First move your anchor point, then move the playhead to where you want your motion to start. Then you click on the stopwatch that you want to animate, or stopwatches. So for this, I'm just going to do rotation. Next, move the playhead. You need a minimum of 2 keyframes, and they have to be at least 1 frame apart. Motion design is graphic design, adding time and space. So I'm just going to randomly move the playhead to here. And then lastly, you make the change you want. Now you can have more than 2 keyframes to do whatever you want, but normally you'll get smoother changes with the less keyframes that you have. So try and do things in the least amount of keyframes that you need to get a smoother motion. I'm going to show you a little trick here. Okay, with rotation, the first number on the left is complete rotation. So if I type in 2, this star will spin around 2 full circles. The number to the right is degrees. So if I wanted my arm to rotate that much, that would just be 45 degrees. But if I wanted to do a full swing around, I'd go to the first number and type 1. I'm going to do 2 full rotations by clicking once, typing in the number 2, and then hitting the Enter key. And as you can see, once I made that change, it created another anchor point, and there it is spinning 2 full rotations. That's the difference with the rotation stopwatch. You can either do full rotations or a specific number of degrees. Now, let's look at scale. For scale, you have a chain. That chain means uniform scaling. So if that chain is on, it's going to scale uniformly, side to side, top to bottom. If you click that off, you will non-uniformly scale that. So if you wanted a tree to grow up, you'd only be scaling on the y-axis, the up and down, and leave the x alone. You've got that type of creativity and flexibility in After Effects. So if you want uniform scaling, make sure that chain is on. If you don't want uniform scaling, click it off, and then you can change the value on either one. I'll demonstrate that. So I'm going to click it off. I know I'm going to want to change the scale non-uniformly. I move my playhead in time, and let's just scale vertically. We're going to scale vertically. You see it's scaling up vertically. The first one on the left, side to side, I left alone, and I only changed the second number up and down. That's the difference between uniform and non-uniform scaling and doing full rotations or a specific amount of degrees. All right, I'm going to delete this shape by selecting and hitting the backspace key, and I'm going to go back to a square. I'm going to draw right here. Okay, so I've deselected my layer and I've reselected. We've gone over the basics. Think about what you want to do, and then figure out how you're going to get there. First, move the anchor point, then move the playhead to where you want it to start. Click on the stopwatch you want to change, then move the playhead. You need a minimum of 1 keyframe to make a change over time, and you need a minimum of 2 keyframes to change anything. The closer those keyframes are together, the faster the change. The further apart they are, the slower that change will be. It's graphic design over time and space. So I'm going to demonstrate this next part with position. I've got my square laid down and the anchor point's in the middle. If I wanted to change it, I'd use the pan behind tool and hold down Control to snap it to a edge or a corner point or a center. So I've got that. And I could get to position by twirling down the transform, which is right here in that layer, or I could just hit the P key. So I'm going to hit the P key. I'm going to move this from one side of the screen to the next. So I know what I want to do. I'm going to move it. So I've got my anchor point where I want to move it. Based off of that motion, I'm going to click the stopwatch, and let's say 2 seconds. So I'm going to move to the 2-second mark, or I could click on my time code and do 2.00, hit the OK. Now I told you before, I could do several ways of moving this. I could use the selection arrow, hold down Shift after I start moving it. That's one way. I'm going to zoom out with my mouse wheel. I could use the hover over and slide technique, but hit Command-Z. Or I could type in a number, like 2000. That's 3 ways of doing it. I'm just going to use the selection arrow and eyeball it like that. So I've got my motion. These blue bars at the end of the timeline, that's your render area. You can click and drag by selecting one of them and adjusting it. What this will do, this will loop the animation when I hit the space bar over and over again, like that. The default keyframe in After Effects is a linear keyframe. And what that is, that's a mechanical motion. It's not speeding up and it's not slowing down over time. So it's like the second hand on a clock constantly moving at a steady speed, or a gear spinning around. It's a mechanical motion. So I'm going to click this button right here. That's my speed graph. And the second button over here shows the speed of what's happening. The value graph is the value of what's happening, how far it's moving in position, or how much it's rotating, or how much it's scaling. That's a value change. The value is how much is changing over time, not the speed of it, okay? If you want to change your velocity in and out of your keyframes, that's the speed graph. I'm going to go to the speed graph right here. Now, you'll notice with linear keyframes, the speed doesn't change over time, so it's a flat line, all right? We're going to change all that. I'm going to go out of my speed graph by clicking the speed graph editor button again. I told you before, you can click on the keyframe to select it. You can mark key drag to select more than one keyframe, or you can click on the word next to the stopwatch. If I click on the word position, it selects all the keyframes I made. Remember, if you click on the stopwatch a second time, it'll turn it off and remove all your keyframes. So I've got them all selected. I'm going to hit the spacebar one more time.